Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. Joining me today is Kat Moss from Hawken Dynamics. Kat and I are going to be diving into the counter movement jump, the counter movement jump rebound, and the squat jump in today's episode. Discussions like this with Kat have really laid the foundation for me to start incorporating force plates into the clinic, and I really appreciate her time, and I'm excited to share what I learned from Kat with all of you. Stay tuned because we've got a number of other episodes just like this coming out. So if you're someone who's new to force plates, this is a phenomenal starting spot. Episodes like this are made possible by our sponsors, ISOFIT and Oro Muscles. For more on ISOFIT and Oro, you can check the description below. Enjoy. Kat, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, no, super glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
For people who might not be familiar with you or this incredible company we're just talking about, Hawkins Dynamics, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the amazing things that you and your team at Hawkins are doing?
Yeah, so I'm actually originally from Colorado, so people always wonder how I ended up on the East Coast, but I grew up coming summers here, went to college out here, and eventually grad school and work out here. So I have a strength coach background, so I have a bachelor's and master's in exercise science, and worked at UMass Lowell as a fellow, and then most recently Colby College before I was at Hawken, big into the weight room space. And then at Hawken, I kind of wear a number of different hats. So I do anything from our onboarding, getting customers started, to some marketing, and I also manage our events and some of our accounts. So I kind of am able to dip into a bunch of different parts of our company, which is really cool. And obviously, Hawken Dynamics is a pretty relatively new small company. It was started in 2017 and we've grown exponentially since then. So now we're kind of worldwide. It's everyone kind of knows of us now, which is awesome. But basically, we like I said, we do force plates really well. So that's kind of our point. We do customer support really well. That's something we kind of capitalize on. Yeah, so we're based here in Maine, which is how I actually got involved with the company. I, live in the area and was working with the force plates when I was at Colby. So I kind of got drawn into the company. So because we are local, we make everything in-house too. So the force plates that you get on your front door we're produced across the hall from where our office is. So that also is kind of cool. So like I have actually helped build some of our force plates. So it's kind of cool because I get like a little inside look into what's going on, but it's also, I think, why we're good company because it's so easy for us to like solve a problem. Like if a user, God forbid, they have an issue, it's like, hey, I can walk across the hall and be like, hey, can you look at this? And then we can get it solved like on the spot.
First off, the fact that you have that college strength and conditioning background, it's like you get it. You speak the language that a lot of coaches and clinicians face on the day to day because you were there in the trenches not that long ago yourself. And I absolutely love your point on, customer service and actually knowing all the things yourself, like having built force plates yourself and getting to wear multiple hats and play many different roles in the company that way. I think that really speaks volumes to the kind of company that Hawkins is, because I think in today's day and age, it's really difficult to find good help. And when you talk about things like force plates, I think that I can speak for everyone in that sometimes we all need a little bit of help because there's so many different things that go into it. There's so many different things that you can do with it, so many metrics you can look at. And I think it's really easy to get lost in the sauce here. For people who aren't familiar with force plates, or maybe they've seen them but don't really know how to define them, what exactly is it that force plates do and how do they work that way?
Yeah, so force plates on a very basic term, they measure force. Obviously, it's in the name. Obviously, us uniquely, we're a bilateral force plate system. So there's a right plate and a left plate. So you can basically do about any movement on them. So as you're pushing into the plates, so that includes anything lower body, upper body, but basically when to jump, move on the plates, you get a force time curve. So your force over the period of time that you're doing that movement. And we're basically assessing that movement. So the efficiency of that movement. So whether it's a counter movement jump, or you could do body weight squats on them, you could do a balance test, you could do an overhead ash test. So kind of like the possibilities are endless. It's kind of creativity on that point. But when you get that force time curve, there's a number of metrics you can get from anything from asymmetries up to performance metrics. So power, force, impulses, etc., like that. And that can also be applied to a number of different settings.
I think you broke that down really well in the sense that they're a tool and how you use them is really up to you because you can really freestyle this thing however you want. But I think understanding that it's important to have some kind of approach to integrating them into whatever system you're running, whether you're in a college strength and conditioning setting or a rehab setting or whatever it is that way. Because like I mentioned, I think it's so easy to get overwhelmed by all that you can do here. I think that having an understanding of how they work, what you can do with them, and then how they fit into your framework as a professional is absolutely essential. And it's so interesting to me. You brought up the counter movement jump as you were talking, because I feel like that's probably the most commonly used thing that I see the force plates for, whether that's just a weekly jump test or a daily jump test every time the athletes come into the weight room, or whether that's from a rehab sense of, just getting an assessment of left versus right on, takeoff and landing that way. But I think that it's important to understand for a lot of these things that we test, there's a lot more than goes into it other than just having an athlete step on a set of plates and jump. There's actually different phases that go into it, and there's different metrics we can look at and so on that way. So on that counter movement jump, would you mind just kind of walking me through that? What are the phases that go into that, and why is it that so many people are testing this metric in particular, this movement in particular, I should say?
Yeah, no, I mean, like you said, like the force plates can be super overwhelming. And so trying to like start off super simple. So that's actually what I tell a lot of our customers starting out is like start off super simple and you can always build upwards. So I always tell everyone start with the counter movement jump. If there's one jump that you could do forever, it'd be the counter movement jump. It's kind of like the king of all the tests. Just one jump, you can get like 80 metrics. And obviously you don't need to look at all those metrics, but you can get metrics about someone's strength, asymmetries, and beyond just with one single jump. So there's so much value that you can draw from that one jump. The counter movement jump in general, it's also super easy as far as like the entry level to it is super low. So it's super easy to do, to teach, to learn, and to, in general, analyze. The standard is a hands-on hips counter jump or akimbo, and sometimes hear it called that way. Basically, having the hands on the hips basically isolates the lower body. So you can basically get a true assessment of lower body. And you talked about the phases. So yeah, there's 6 kind of key phases of the counter movement jump, which is how we break it down in our system as well. So there starts out with the quiet phase. So in our system, that's basically when you're standing on the force plates. This is taking your body weight into account and basically is like a test standardization. So we basically use that body weight to get any relative metrics. And also when we're assessing force, it's kind of our base force. From there goes into the unweighing. This is basically the first downward movement of a jump. So it's when you initially see someone, their knees start to unlock, start to get some ankle flexion. So they initially start to move down. And this is a little bit going to be sport specific as well. So you'll kind of see different unweighing shapes and phases. In theory, the better you can unweigh, the better your braking and propulsive the rest of your jump's going to be. Because if you can't efficiently unweigh, so sometimes that's like limiting is like range of motion can be limited from that section. The next is a braking. So this is actually when you're still in like a downward fall. And a lot of people get this confused with like they're calling it like eccentric portion, which it is and it isn't. Because in theory, you are eccentrically moving, but you also are concentrically contracting your muscles. It's basically stopping yourself from falling through the floor. And the braking phase is probably one of the most important phases of the counter movement jump, because this is where you have like any asymmetries that might pop up in the jump, and because this is where the most like force is applied. And basically at the bottom of the braking phase is when you're at your lowest point in the jump. So someone's going down, it's that deepest point you're going to be in. So max flexion, max force on the joints. So if you have anything that's hurting you, that's bothering you, it's going to pop up in that braking. Next is for propulsive. So push off, or sometimes people, again, concentric. It is mostly concentric, but we like to say it's propulsive phase, or think of it as like the push off phase. So this is where those power metrics come from, peak relative propulsive power, a common metric that people kind of chase after that. And then after there is flight. So you're in the air, and then also it's sling with our plates. That's obviously a little bit unique about force plates, is that we actually don't calculate jump height based off of flight time like a jump mat. So you can't actually cheat our force plates. Like as soon as you actually leave the ground, we actually know what your jump height's going to be even before you land on the ground, or even if you don't land on the ground at all, because we use takeoff velocity. So during that kind of like push off phase. So then after a flight, then you have landing. So landing back on the plates, which landing is kind of a funny thing because people are like, oh, like landing is the most important part of a jump. But especially like a counter movement jump, where maybe you are trying to get a maximal jump, if someone like kind of stumbles, all of a sudden those landing metrics are thrown off, and that's maybe not a true representation of someone's landing. But if you're doing anything like a return to play, that's when like that landing might be a little bit more important. But those are kind of 6 key phases, if you will, of the counter move jump.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point on the whole concept of cheating the jump mat, because I had someone trying to do that earlier today, and it didn't go too well for him. But it's so interesting that, your algorithm that way essentially calculates that jump height, as opposed to measuring flight time, measuring it based off of velocity that way, like you mentioned. So I find that really interesting. And it's interesting how you brought up the braking phase being an area where we start to see the asymmetries kind of develop that way, because from the way my mind is thinking about this, especially in relation to the stretch shortening cycle, like we need to be able to move from braking to propulsive phase fast. It's almost like a slingshot, right? We shoot back and then we shoot up.
Right.
So if we're losing something in that phase, then I would imagine we would see jump height actually is lower, because we're not able to kind of propel upwards as efficiently as maybe we should be able to.
Yeah, and like kind of talks about like there's so many different aspects you can look at a counter jump. Part of looking at counter jump is actually the shape of the curve. And that's something that I've also learned over time, that you couldn't actually look at a curve of someone without some of the metrics and actually pull a lot of insights from that. So someone that like struggles with getting out of that bottom position, like breaking into propulsive, you'll almost see like a flat line at the top of their force time curve. So they basically get to braking and then they're like stuck at the bottom. So they almost like hover there. So you might, maybe from the eye can't see that, but from like in milliseconds, they're stuck at the bottom. So someone, needs that might be a little bit weaker in theory, that needs just pure like concentric strength. Or obviously it's also be a little bit sport dependent too. So lots of times people are like, oh, what's the ideal curve? And like in theory, there's a more efficient curve, which the counter jump is basically assessing your efficiency and movement. But if you look at different sports, that's going to look a little bit different. If you're a basketball player, you're used to getting out quick from maybe, quarter squat position. Your transition in theory might be kind of good. If you're looking at maybe like a swimmer who starts from a truly concentric position, that's going to look a little bit different. Or even at a novice athlete, all the way through, an elite athlete. Like if you look at like a snowboarder, for example, their force time curve, you would look at it and you'd be like, what is going on? Because it's like flat, nothing going on. But they also aren't producing force in their sport. Like it's not about producing pure force versus a basketball player. They have to produce force. They're jumping all the time. So it's a lot of context as well.
Yeah, no, and I think you brought up a great point there, in that, with the counter movement jump, or really with any kind of test, data in the data world, context is king at the end of the day. We just talked about this recently with Anthony Cockrell on the podcast, and I can't remember what metric in particular we were discussing, but essentially this concept came up of, there's a metric that we want really, really low in a certain athletic population, and we want it really, really high in another athletic population. And if you don't understand what goes into the sport, you might be looking for one thing and get something completely different and misinterpret the data that you've collected that way. So understanding, based on what you said, it sounds like there should be a shape to the counter movement jump, the graph that you get, and that's a measurement of the efficiency of the movement. We might have some different inefficiencies along the way, but understanding that the main goal of this is movement efficiency and not necessarily some of the other things that people often look for the counter movement jump for.
Yeah, I mean, like in theory, the counter jump is assessing like athletic efficiency and like capabilities. So obviously there's a bunch of metrics we can pull from that. But like I said, like a snowboarder's kind of a jump first time curve is going to look different from a pro basketball players, and like that's okay. And so efficient for a sport might look different. It's like important to also look at like individual athletes as well. So people are always asking for norms on stuff, and like your greatest norm is your own population and like an athlete themselves. Like in theory, like I said, when I was working at Colby, we had the force plates for a few years before I got there. So there's a few athletes we had 4 years of data on. And it's kind of cool, like to click back through a jump from like their freshman year to their senior year and be like, wow, these look like 2 different athletes. But it's like they just actually improved. and like that force time curve in general improved. Like they got more efficient. Obviously, they got better, they got stronger, whatever. But using even like an athlete themselves as their own comparative data is important. That in itself has context because certain athletes have their own strategy and every athlete's gonna have their own strategy. And maybe there's certain things you might start try to change about certain strategies to make them more efficient or better. But I'm gonna look a little bit different than someone even my same age, height, weight, whatever, just because of our kinematics and our training and our background as well. So
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And it almost allows you to look at every athlete like their own individual case study. N equals
right.
one in this case. You can collect the data from them, and then you can measure that data over time and, observe the trends in real time, really. And you mentioned before about the sheer volume of metrics that go into something like this counter movement jump that way. When you were assessing these at Colby and when you were looking back at 4 years of data, where did you start from a metric standpoint? What things really jumped out to you? What did you find value and importance with, or was there anything that you find that you kind of put lesser stock in that way?
Yeah, like I said, so many metrics you can look at, and there's kind of like a few different categories you can look at metrics. I see like monitoring, benchmarking, profiling are kind of the three different categories. We often break up like reasons you might look at metrics. We also do something called the ODS system. So it's kind of how we've gone to break down some of our different categories of metrics and basically output driver strategy. So think of it that way. So output, your pure like more like performance metrics. So think like jump height, MRSI, like those are metrics you're chasing from like literally like this is a result of a jump. Driver is like what's behind that. So your forces, your impulses. So picking a few from that. So one of those is like your left, right average braking force. That could also be a strategy. So strategy is as it sounds a strategy. So think counter movement depth. So how deep are they going on that counter movement jump? Time to take off. How long are they taking to get off the ground? But one of the most like helpful metrics is that left right average braking force. It's during that braking phase, like I mentioned earlier, but it's basically your percentage of difference in your asymmetry during the braking phase. So that can be a key metric, A, for flagging an injury that might be happening down the road or a previous injury. So like I have an extra vertebrae and an extra large transverse processus on my left side. So if you look at my jump, you're like, what is going on? Like you're a red flag for an injury. But it's kind of cool for like I've been able to track that as an individual. Hey, I know certain days when I'm hurting more, oh, that metric flags way up. Or when I was actually at Colby, I did kind of a case study on a bunch of my ACL return to play athletes, and that was one of the metrics I tracked. And then I also did like single leg counter movement jumps, and I could compare like right versus left. So I could use some of those CMJ depth, which is kind of a range of motion metric, jump height, time takeoff, and compare right leg versus left leg and actually see those improvements over time to get someone back to a baseline value, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, and if you had the years of data previously, you knew what that baseline was. And not
Right.
to mention, you knew that, hey, maybe we could actually push a little bit past that this time around because clearly, prior level function might not have always been enough to prevent injury. And I think also being able to look at it retrospectively like that, maybe you can start to, if you have the time to do it, analyze some of that data a little bit and say, hey, look, is there anything that popped up like, hey, all of a sudden this number dropped 50% right before their injury occurred.
Right.
Because I think that's the other piece to this puzzle is, I don't think anyone is ever going to be able to predict every single injury that happens. But, if you have the data and you have the time and the ability to look back at it, you might as well just look and see if you can find anything. And maybe you do, maybe you don't. The other piece to this as well is since it's such a simple movement to test, like I mentioned before, I think that the counter movement jump could realistically be tested every single time you see your athletes because it takes so little time to do. I think the biggest thing I would see from it from my own eyes is just repeatability of your test in the sense that if you're going to test it, do it in the same context every day. So a lot of times I'll see athletes come in and, they'll jump on plates and test and it's like, well, they just had 2 hours of practice. Well, the number you get after 2 hours of practice is probably not going to be the same versus if you tested them before practice. So understanding, going back to what you mentioned before about context being the most essential element of this, understanding that your data might look different on the day-to-day if you don't standardize some of those other factors that go into it as well.
Yeah, no, 100%. Something that I try to like tell like our new users is like come up with like schedule of how you want to have athletes jump. So like, yeah, is it going to be before practice or after practice every day? And obviously more jumps, the better. If you got them jump every day, like awesome. But come up with a consistent schedule and then also cueing. So talking about like context, like if you cue your athletes different every time they jump, it's probably going to look different. Like you don't realize how much just a few words can impact someone. But I always like tell athletes like hands on hips, jump as high and as fast as you can. And like that's it. Like don't cue anything more. Like with athletes, you can over cue just like you can with any exercise. If you say more, it's actually less because they hear one thing and the rest of it's out the door. So like, yeah, coming up with like a schedule. I actually at Colby had it as part of like our warm up. So A, B, C of the warm up was always this counter move and jump. We always had, a few things, prime them, counter move and jump, and then that was how they did. And we actually taught our athletes how to do the test themselves. So I was pretty hands off. So they knew how to do it correctly. It was also kind of cool because the athletes had accountability for themselves, and it became just a part of lift. It wasn't like anything extra. And we talked about kind of like, integrating it into your system, like finding a way that it's like pretty seamless. So it was a C block of warm up, and then it was just part of it. And then you got to be consistent because I don't have to worry about, oh, I forgot to do it because it was after lift. In theory, it's as standardize it as I could make it, obviously within the context of practices, whatever, but having that as much standards as possible, that I knew the data I was getting was at least valid as much as I could make it.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And as you were talking as well, I realized, we mentioned a few different metrics and different things that way. But I think there's certain metrics, and as you were talking too, I also remembered that the metric Anthony and I were talking about in a podcast I referenced a second ago was the eccentric utilization ratio, EUR, which I think can only be calculated if you do counter movement jump and a squat jump as well. I had a student that was coming in for their first time, just kind of shadowing, observing, wants to be a physical therapist someday. And they even brought up the question of like, what's different about these two things? Like, hey, that looks a lot like this. Why are we doing them differently that way? So in that concept of counter movement versus squat jump that way, what exactly is the difference? Because they're usually used in conjunction with one another, I believe.
Yeah, so basically the squat jump is just testing the pure force production, so pure the concentric portion of counter jump. So actually some people in our system get upset because our squat jump is super sensitive, so any counter movement at all failed the test. So we have like pro teams that are like, oh, squat jump doesn't work in your system, like it's broken. We're like, nope, you just like have to do it correctly. But basically, yeah, it's the pure just concentric portion. You can think of it that way, or a propulsive portion of that jump. Honestly, someone not being able to do it alone is a data point in itself. Because lots of times either they're not strong enough concentrically to purely produce force from quarter squat position. And so like they just literally need to be stronger. And obviously it's a skill thing as well. But if you can obviously test the CMJ and then also the squat jump, it basically assesses your like efficiency of the stretch shortening cycle. So ideally you would want your, an ideal athlete would be a 1-to-1 ratio of jump height of CMJ and a squat jump. Most often, obviously, that doesn't happen. But again, kind of being of context, if you have, a swimmer, they start from a static start all the time. So you probably want that to be more of a 1-to-1. Like you want them to produce force from that squat position versus if you have a different athlete that isn't essentially, starting from a static position, that's probably not going to be the case. And maybe that's not a priority because you don't need to be as worried about that. It's a great test for just pure like concentric force and like your energy transfer. Like, how efficient are you at that when you look at the two of them together?
Coupling the two together and again getting a further understanding of the athlete's efficiency that way. I think that's something, the term efficiency is thrown a lot around a lot. And I think a lot of times coaches kind of look at it and they're like, well, does it matter? And I think at the end of the day, at least in my opinion, it really does, because if we're losing power because of deficits in some region that way, then we're leaving performance gains on the table. And it's like, we could do better, but we're just going to accept where we're at. And, in the world of sports that I live in today's day and age, if people could be better, they want to be better. They don't want to settle for just being good enough a majority of the time. And on your point on the squat jump there as well, I think this is a huge application in the ACL rehab world, because I can't even begin to tell you the amount of times I see athletes struggle to get that vertical power metric back in particular. And they really, really rely heavily on the counter movement portion of that to produce force. So much so that in the majority of my jump tests, I'll test counter movement and non-counter movement, which is essentially squat jump, and
Right.
it's essentially the same thing. But I'll do it on like a jump mat or different things that way earlier on in the process. And it's always interesting for them to see just how different the number really is. And especially on a single leg metric as well, because when we're talking about these so far, we're talking about double leg, but I believe you can do one leg at a time as well, correct?
Yeah, you could do single legs. I refer to like a single leg counter movement jump, which is like a great rehab tool, but you could do a single leg anything, such because they're bilateral. And you could like actually in our app, you could literally do an instant like right versus left leg, which is kind of cool. And you actually see the force traces overlaid. So it's actually a great tool for an athletes who don't realize, like they're like, oh, like it's fine right to left. And then you show them the actual graph and they're like, oh, like it's a little bit of a wake up call to be like, oh, I guess it is different. But yeah, you could do right versus left, which like in theory, like even your, uninjured side, maybe there's, improvements you can make there when you don't have your other leg to depend on.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but you could also switch from one leg to the other as well, like a bound, in the sense that you could start on the right and then jump over to the left and land on the left, correct? Like my right plate is here, left plate is here. I could go right to left, left to right almost.
In theory, you could. So how our force plates read is right force and left force. So you'd have to just be clear of, where you're kind of picking from. But we do have like a free run setting, basically, that's kind of an open-ended test. So there's like center of pressure metrics, or you could do like a bounds. I know we have some like hockey programs that will do bounds and just compare, push off, because obviously our force plates only measure Z force, but that can be obviously applied to horizontal movement. So they'll bound from one plate to the other and then, yeah, compare like peak force from one plate or the other plate. So.
You also mentioned, as you were talking about the squat jump, that this is something a lot of athletes, even at high levels, really struggle to do, and be able to produce movement or produce power without the counter movement that way. From your experience as a strength coach yourself, has there been anything that you've done to actually help improve the athlete's ability to produce power without a counter movement that way? Because I think this is something that a lot of people see, but not a whole lot of people know how to intervene on.
Yeah, no, I mean, so like in theory of like the test itself, like sometimes starting like a deeper squat. So like people are a little bit stronger from like more of like a 90 position sometimes, but like, pin squats, isometrics. I was always a fan of, doing tempos, isometrics. So having to stop at that bottom position in a loaded squat and get back up. That's probably the easiest way. Just anything that's like pure force production. So think of anything also like trap bar jumps, something, anything like that, where it's purely focused on just up. So isometrics are probably the easiest low entry barrier, like loaded squats, throw some isos on there.
I've always got to plug ISOs because
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
the
you're welcome.
podcast is
I gave you the intro.
sponsored by, we don't have to go down this rabbit hole by any means, but I think it's so interesting when we, look at the amount of different things we can improve, especially from a force production standpoint by training isometrically. It's amazing to me how overlooked that is in this plyometric world that we live in from a testing standpoint, because, so far we've talked about two jump tests in particular. And, a lot of people think, well, in order to jump better, I need to jump more. And sometimes there's more than one way to skin a cat, so to speak. Now, the other thing, you can do the counter movement like we talked about, the squat, which is essentially more of a non-counter movement. But then there's also the like rebound jump metric as well, I believe, or rebound jump test as well, I believe, which from my understanding is essentially we're going to do a counter movement jump or a squat jump, and then we're going to do another one right afterward.
Yeah, so CMJ rebound. So it's two CMJs back to back. So this is basically a hybrid test between a CMJ and a drop jump. So this is actually created by John McMahon, who works for us now. He's known as the force plate coach on Instagram. He's pretty widely known, but basically it allows you to have a fast and a slow stretch shortening cycle within one test. So first CMJ, normal, like a normal CMJ, and then basically the goal is on that second CMJ is to get off the ground as fast as possible. So kind of just two different like ways that people sometimes cue them. It's either like one maximal CMJ and the second CMJ, get off as fast as you can, or there's just doing two maximal CMJs back to back, which is more common and what I always cued athletes to do. So two CMJs maximally back to back. So ideally you're jumping as high and as fast as you can on both. And the idea behind that is the CMJ rebound is kind of a good way that if you want to get like a drop jump, more of a reactive test, it's two CMJs back to back. So if you're already taught an athlete how to do a CMJ, they can do a CMJ rebound because it's just two CMJs back to back. So it's a really easy test, kind of like add in to your testing profile because it's like basically the same thing, but you get kind of another layer of metrics on top of that. So it's an easy test for like performance, but also like rehab because of the basically intensity of the jump. So someone is like a late stages of like a return to play. If they do a CMJ, maybe their force time curve starting to look good, those metrics are improving. But when they're asked to do two, that second CMJ, they're falling from a higher height. So it's kind of a self-selected height too, think of it that way, which is kind of cool. Sometimes with drop jumps, the issue is like, oh, is the box height too low? Is it too high? So with a CMJ rebound, the athlete's self-selecting that drop height because it's the height of their jump height of that first one. And then obviously they have to fall from that height and get back off the plates from that. So obviously it can kind of translate, hey, can they transfer that energy from that first jump into the second one? And then if you have like an asymmetry, it will come out in that second jump, like 100%. Like even my own jumps that I do, I'm like, wow, like I need to work on that because if anything, like you'll have like the amount of force that you have to basically translate into another jump is pretty high. So it's pretty high like intensity on your body, like one of the most like intense like jumping ones at least.
But the nice thing about a lot of these jump tests is you don't have to do 30 jumps to assess the data. So even though it's intense, you're probably not doing more than 3 at a time, if I had to guess.
Yeah, like do like 1 or 2 CMJs and then like 1 or 2 CMJ rebounds, and then you're good to go.
And then you're done. And it's so interesting because as I was reading about the rebound earlier, I believe there's like a key caveat of it in the sense that the rebound itself had to be fast enough to be called like a true rebound jump, I believe. So essentially, kind of like you brought up with the squat jump, a lot of people will fail it because they still sink into a counter movement type of position that way. With the CMJ rebound, the rebound itself has to be fast enough to actually call it a rebound, I believe.
So in theory, you want it to be under 250 milliseconds, a second rebound, for it to be like assessing the fast stretch shortening cycle. Because if it's under that, it's basically like you're doing literally 2 CMJs versus like a CMJ rebound. So yeah, you want it ideally to be under that 250 millisecond mark to make it, fast stretch shortening a cycle assessment. So a reactive assessment basically. So to actually get the benefit of testing a reactive jump there.
And I'd imagine, kind of like you talked about with the squat jump, the inability to produce force without a counter movement is a sign within itself.
Yeah.
I would imagine here as well, the inability to achieve a fast stretch shortening cycle can also really give you a lot of information about the athlete. And that might not necessarily come in the form of like a number metric. It might just come in the fact that they just can't hit that speed.
Exactly. And so and again, like I said, context is king. We go back to that probably every time, and that's something to we like drill into people. But like it is true, and that like sometimes like again looking at like different athletes, and like look at the sport, look at the athlete who you're looking at. Obviously, you want them to be able to hit that fast, on 250 milliseconds. But like if the sport isn't a very fast sport, maybe that's not important, But you're looking at it from more like an asymmetry standpoint, so it can still be useful. But like if you look like a volleyball player, they have that ability to like get off the ground because that's what they do in their sport all the time. Versus you're looking at maybe more of like a field sport, maybe a little bit different. Like they aren't doing a purely jump into one thing or another like a soccer player. Obviously they're reactive, but it's a little bit different than a volleyball player reactiveness. So looking at it from that context as well. But like I said, the CMJ rebound can still be helpful even if you don't hit that 250 milliseconds. knowing that maybe you're not looking at it for that RSI value or MSI value, then you're looking at for the asymmetry value in the
Right.
shape of the curve. Because someone's like second CMJ rebound, that rebound jump, if it's like all over the place, that's like could be a flag for like an injury. Because in sport, nothing you do in sport is once. No matter what sport it is, it's like multifaceted. Like it's a jump or a turn and a run, something. So those two back to back, you can kind of relay that into sport. So in that rebound, if that second rebound looks kind of messy, you have asymmetries all over the place, that could be a flag for injury. Like, hey, you can't handle a higher force production or force back to back. Like that's like we got to work on some strength or whatever it is that's kind of missing.
So hypothetically, that second rebound should be a very clean kind of graph and clean kind of picture. But in reality, if it's a case where we have athletes who might have some kind of concerning signs that way, that's where it will most likely show up, and that's where things will get messy on our graph and on our picture that way. It's more in that rebound phase that way. Is
Yeah.
there any other kind of relation between the first and the second counter movement jump in this rebound kind of test that way that you look at, as far as we look for equal flight time, or we look for, a certain relation on force and braking or something like that? Like, how else does the first to second counter movement jump? Are there any kind of ratios or metrics that you look at just in the relation of the first jump to the second jump themselves?
Yeah, I mean, and you kind of referred to a little bit earlier, like that transfer in energy. So like in theory, you want your jump height of your second CMJ rebound to actually be higher than your first, because you actually have like more energy in theory that you could transfer in the second one. Lots of times it's not, because people don't have the ability to transfer energy. Like they lose it in that like breaking of the rebound. So basically when they come back down off of that first jump, they like really struggle to get out of the hole and kind of push it back up. So kind of similar, but first with the counter movement jump, someone's force time curve might be kind of stretched out, like they have a really hard time getting out of that hole. You'll see that in the CMJ rebound as well. So like ability to transfer energy. So jump height, it's honestly one of the first things I always look at. Is there a jump height of a CMJ and a CMJ rebound the same, or ideally better? And then you can kind of look at similar metrics that you would for like a drop jump as well on that rebound. So you can look at like obviously an RSI value, MSI value, but it needs to be like a maximal get off as fast to ground as you can. If it is under that 250 milliseconds, then it's not going to be worth it there. And then looking at the asymmetries as well. Those are probably the main things I'd look at.
Again, I feel like this concept of asymmetries continues to come up as we talk about these jumps. And I guess I kind of wonder myself, again, going back to that concept of context, what level of asymmetry is acceptable versus not acceptable? Because there are certain sports, right? Like baseball, for example, when they're running the bases, they're always making left turns. I've noticed it's almost like running the bases is almost like the running equivalent of NASCAR, for lack of a better way to put it. You're always going the same way. So, and even from a throwing standpoint, right? Like pitchers usually have a little bit of a difference in their throwing versus non-throwing arm. So I think understanding that in the world of athletics, there are sometimes asymmetries that are almost like adaptive to the sport itself. And other times there are asymmetries that develop because of things like you mentioned, whether that's injury to tissue or potential injury in the future or something along those lines. And I think that, while the data points and the numbers and the metrics are so important and so interesting to, review that way, I think there also has to be a certain element of understanding who your athletes are, what they're doing, what their sport is, and really kind of getting to know them as people, their playing style, and kind of taking all these other factors into account when you look at these kind of jump tests and when you look at these kind of metrics as well. Because, like you mentioned before, every athlete is a little bit different, and you have to look at each one like an individual. And you can't always take, while generalizations are good, you can't always take an entire team of athletes and apply those metrics across the board, because they're all a little bit different in one way or another.
What we say in theory is like everyone, like I said, everyone has their natural asymmetry, and like that's okay relatively, like there's obviously outliers on that. In theory, like what we say is, so someone jumps first on the jump, okay, once they'll have a natural asymmetry, whatever it is, and like how it is in our system, like I refer to the left-right average braking force metric. It'll give you a negative or a positive percentage. So negative percentage in our system means favoring right, positive percentage means favoring left. So you have negative or positive X percentage. Once that's kind of established, so we've done whatever plethora of jumps here, we say that within 10% of that amount. So if you have a negative 4%, you want to be around that percentage. If all of a sudden you flip, to the positive 10, 15%, maybe that's a red flag. Or, okay, you go in the negative position. Okay, now you're negative 20%. And then we say in theory that a 15% in either positive or negative direction, so right or left, is just a red flag alone in itself. Because then, that's a significant amount of difference. You'll know, you'll probably be able to visually, in theory, probably see that as well. And the athlete probably has an idea that that's something's going on as well. But usually 10% within their norm, we say, is about standard for what you should be looking at.
Any of these things that we've talked about today, squat, jump, counter movement, rebound, have the ability to be done under a loaded sense. And I say that because I distinctly remember one of the guys we had on the podcast a few years ago who was obsessed with this concept of dumbbell jumps. And if his athletes were coming to work with him, they were going to hold a dumbbell in each hand and they were going to jump. It was a guarantee. So is that something that you could also work in from the force plate side is, we can do all these jumps, but we could also maybe see how we perform under loaded conditions as well?
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, the possibilities are endless with force plates. So there's basically the ability to tag any of the tests. So basically create your own test type off of another test type or test variation. So we have people do loaded jumps all the time. So you literally either do a counter movement jump or even a squat jump, tag it, loaded, plus 35 pounds or percentage of body weight, whatever it is, and then do your jump. And you could actually build a report either comparing a loaded squat jump versus a non-loaded, or build your own report of just those loaded jumps. So you can 100% do that. And basically you have the ability also to basically discount body weight. So it wouldn't throw off any of your relative metrics or anything like that, but you could definitely compare those, which is kind of an interesting point. Options definitely there.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I also realized as we were talking, we talked a lot about how these fit into the performance setting. We talked a little bit about how they fit into the return to play setting. I also think that there's potential to use any of these kind of movements just from a general training or rehab setting. In my clinic in particular, I work with one patient at a time, period. It's very individualized. And it's we do some of these different jump type movements as part of our regular training. I have athletes jump. I know it's a shocker, oh my gosh, we're going to jump in PT, really? But I think that, while it's great to use this as a testing tool, you can also use it as a training tool in the sense that you get that real-time feedback. And while I mentioned before about the importance of conversations with athletes, I've noticed sometimes athletes don't tell us everything. And sometimes you can actually see some of these different things on the number standpoint in real time. So for example, if all of a sudden peak force is down significantly, it's hey, this was 20% higher 2 days ago. What's going on here? You good? And I think it can be a way to kind of pick up on other things that might get missed otherwise. So I think, with that in mind, the potential benefits are really intangible because while we get the data, it also kind of informs us to other things that we might want to know from a training standpoint. We also get the, real-time benefit of noting some of those different things you mentioned, like the asymmetries or different metrics that way, every single time we work with them. So we can kind of build that trend over time, which is where I personally see a lot of value is, it's great to test people once a month or once a week that way. But I think it's really powerful, like you mentioned before, with having 4 years of data, it's really powerful to be able to see the trend that someone builds over time. And then you can kind of notice those days when things aren't going as well kind of stand out a little bit more. Or, you can kind of use that as a assessment to your programming and say, hey, look, we were able to build this upward trend for this person over this period of time and get to this point. Now, how can we go back? What could we change to maybe do that in a faster, time period? Or what could we do to maybe get to a higher peak of whatever metrics you're, primarily focusing on that way?
Yeah, and I mean it's kind of like it's another tool in your toolbox. So it's another toolbox as like a coach, like I said, like whether it's chasing certain training goals or seeing how a program did play out, but also for like the athlete themselves. I think that was kind of cool, especially when I was working in the strength and conditioning field, is that we taught the athletes what some of the metrics meant and taught them how to actually do the jump, and then it kind of put it in their own hands as well. So you kind of mentioned, hey, maybe some of the athletes aren't telling us. So like, hey, like these metrics are down today. What's going on? Like, do we didn't sleep or practice is hard or something going on in life that whatever is making these metrics go down, but also puts on the athlete to a little like introspect, reflect too, because the athletes they start to get interested as they start to understand it a little bit. So it's something that they can do, or maybe it doesn't have to be an athlete, can be a patient, using it as a training tool. So whether it is just a counter move and jump of being like, oh, that's down, it's like, oh yeah, like I guess like sleep does actually affect how I train, whether just like a little bit of a little spark that relates to something, or like I said, like if it's showing them in like a feedback right away of like whether it's like even if it's doing a loaded like body weight squat, maybe it's not even a jump, of them seeing it for their own eyes. It's like it's not just you telling them like, oh, it's not good. It's them seeing those metrics that reflect for themselves. So I think it's kind of cool. I think that's force plates too, is it gives like sports science to like people that might not have been exposed to or had the option to be exposed to it all. Like you said, like in a PT setting, for example, like I went to PT 10 years ago, we definitely didn't have force plates in the clinic, and I wish we did because like that would have been really helpful to like see my own progress on them, but also like as I'm doing an exercise or improving in certain points throughout it, having benchmarks that I can like chase that aren't just like, oh, your flexibility improved or your strength improved, you could do a little bit more weight. Like there's other things that you can apply to that. It like gives what you do a little bit more depth almost.
As you mentioned as well, and as we kind of outlined today, like I think this world for people to get into can seem a little daunting at first because there's a lot to it. But in reality, a lot of people are already training counter movement and non-counter movement jumps. They're already part of your training
Yeah, like you
program.
do it every day and you don't realize it.
Yeah, so it's like you can already take movements that you've done thousands of times or programmed thousands of times and now actually get some kind of data metric and assessment from it very quickly, very easily that way. And I think the other piece to this as well is, when I traditionally look at a lot of the return to play protocols for ACL in particular, because that's what a lot of my practice focuses on, there's a lot of hop tests, there's a lot of strength tests, there's not a whole lot looking at this vertical plane. And, in my limited experience thus far, I find a lot of athletes struggle more with getting their vertical power metrics back than their horizontal metrics. And I'm not sure if that's just, the concept of it being harder to cheat that vertical vector than the horizontal vector, or if it's just, hey, a lot of athletes struggle to reproduce or, recreate that vertical power that way after a major surgery where, we disrupt their extensor mechanism the majority of the time. But having the ability to assess a lot of different metrics that go into that and integrate a vertical measure into a return to play process, I think gives us a little bit more information. And I think that's something we should all be kind of like striving for, in the sense that our athletes are always evolving. Their injuries are always evolving. So therefore, our process to getting them back to sport at the highest level possible also has to be evolving. And, when we look historically at the numbers around ACL, especially, our numbers are not great in the sense that 1 in 3 did not get back. So I think that kind of leads us to, again, question, what can we be doing to evolve? And I think that integrating something like the force plate metrics or the force plate test that we discussed today to actually look at some more advanced metrics and some more insight into that vertical power metric in particular can be really, really impactful there.
Vertical ground reaction forces are part of like every movement, like the base of it. Like you have to move upward a little bit, even if you are doing horizontal. Like sprinting ability has been like seen, like certain geometrics be correlated to sprint ability. So like there is like a correlation between like improving your vertical force to improving your sprint ability, even though people are like, oh, that's a horizontal thing. So like just improving, because if you're improving your vertical force production, that also means you're probably stronger. That means your increases like your plyometric ability, produce more force faster. That applies to any sport or really any setting, or even gen pop, if we're able to move better, faster, better, faster, stronger, like, we say that, but like that's also kind of true.
Yeah, I mean, on that Gen Pop note for a second there, I mean, do you know how many people in Gen Pop play pickleball nowadays?
I think everyone does. I think I'm the only one who doesn't.
I don't either. But some of these people, pickleball is a way of life.
Yeah, it's
So
become like the thing now. Like if
yeah.
you play pickleball, like oh.
So I certainly think that you can, look at force plate metrics in Gen Pop as well. And on that note, I don't think athleticism has a age limit to it. So, just because you have someone who's, I don't know, 50 years old doesn't mean they still can't tear their ACL or, doesn't mean that they're never going to play a sport again. So understanding that there's certainly more of a broad application across the lifespan to these things, even though my personal bias tends to be a little bit more towards the sports performance and rehab side of things.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, ideally, hopefully, as forces become more popular, they are available to more Gen Pop situations. Like, maybe in 10 years down the road, there are in your Planet Fitness, so you could do a force play assessment, which obviously would be like the dream. I'll work on my sales pitch to Planet Fitness after this, but no, but having the idea of like anyone in sport like doesn't have like an age range on that. So like there are things that can apply to everyday life. And like so we have the plates are used in like a hospital setting that people use it for like a sit to stand. So like it can be even used for like that isn't necessarily like sport related. So like Gen Pop as a general like every person, like whether like concussion testing, like it's used for that, or even for like return from like literally like a car accident or something of like being able to have like when you're standing there, do you have even force between your right foot and your left foot? And then obviously that can be applied to other settings, but there's not like a stop limit on what they can be used for, or in like the different settings, like you said, like Gen Pop, like maybe we have them in like retirement homes and like, that's a way to like longevity.
I think most people want to live a longer, higher quality of life after all. Most people that I know anyways. And, on that note as well, it's like, I think we also need to realize that we have to care about where our athletes go after college. And it's like, it's not just athletes now, it's athletes for life, ideally. We can hopefully use some of these things to help get them interested enough where maybe, just maybe, they stay training after college. It's a win at the end of the day. But I feel like that could be talked about until we're both blue in the face, Kat. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts or closing remarks or anything that we might have missed as we were chatting about force plates and the three different jump tests that we hit today?
I think that like anyone like looking into force plates is like it doesn't have to be complex. Like you can keep it simple and still get a lot of value out of even if you just did the three tests that we talked about today, or even just a counter move and jump, like pick one thing and run with it. Like integrate it into your system, figure out what works for you. Every situation is unique. Every practice you're gonna be is unique. But keeping it simple, you can get a lot more than if you try to go all out and go, we're going to do every single test every single day. So it's a lot more user friendly and tangible than most people think. Like keep it simple, like I would say, like get consistent data consistently.
Keep it simple and keep it consistent. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that the more you do that, the more you're kind of able to, unwrap this puzzle or this, this thing that everyone seems to think is so complex and realize actually it's not that bad. Actually, I can do this. And again, like we talked about, there's so many different metrics and, you can find that you like one of them, you can find that you like five of them, or you can find, what? I really like this weird one that no one's ever heard about before, and that's okay.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, as long as you're getting the results that you're after, you're happy and your athletes are happy, then, the job is done in my mind. For people who want to find out more about you, who want to find out more about Hawkins and that sort of thing that way, where can they find you all at?
On Instagram, we post a lot of stuff. So myself, the coach Kat. I was post stuff for Hawken Dynamics, but also hawkendynamics.com or just at Hawken Dynamics. We post a lot of educational resources as well on our Instagram. We also have a bunch of blogs that we post there as well. So that's probably the best way, or just hawkendynamics.com.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. We'll link to all of that in the description below as well. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there. And I mean, you're one of the few brands I've actually seen on TikTok as well. So kudos
We have
to you
started to
all
dive into
for
the TikTok
making it to
space.
the 21st century. Next time you're on, we can talk about TikTok dancing on force plates, maybe, and the metrics there. Kat, no, this was great. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for being on.
No, thanks so much for having me.